The stretch of coastline where desert meets the Mediterranean has seen countless armies rise and fall, but few battles have been so overshadowed, so eclipsed by the titanic clashes that followed, as the one at Mersa El Brega. Locked between shifting dunes and a restless sea, the small Libyan town became the stage for an encounter that would decide the tempo of the North African campaign long before the world knew the name El Alamein. It was here, in March 1941, that men fought in heat, dust, and disbelief, in a clash that history rarely pauses to remember. Yet, those who survived would never forget the day war arrived on that lonely coastline, roaring like a storm that had long been waiting beyond the horizon. For months before the battle, the Western Desert Force had chased the Italians eastward, from Sidi Barrani to Bardia, from Tobruk to Derna, and finally to El Agheila. These victories had been swift, almost unbelievable, but they left British and Commonwealth forces stretched thin. Many soldiers joked that they were chasing ghosts. The Italian lines collapsed with such speed that there were no dramatic last stands, no epic confrontations, just long convoys rolling through sand and sun, stumbling upon abandoned encampments and discarded equipment. But while the Italians fell back, something else was arriving behind them, something the British command did not yet fully understand. That something, wore goggles and dust-stained uniforms. It drove machines painted in colors that blended with the desert. It moved aggressively, quickly, with a confidence that seemed to belong to a different kind of war. This was the Afrika Korps, led by a newly arrived general whose reputation had not yet become legend, Rommel. And Mersa El Brega would be his first real opportunity to show the world what he intended to do. The British defensive line at Mersa El Brega was thin, improvised, and exhausted. The men who held it belonged mostly to the 2nd Support Group of the 2nd Armored Division, along with elements of the 1st Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps. They had little rest after their months-long pursuit of the Italians. Their vehicles were worn, their supplies uncertain, and their numbers nowhere near what a defensive line ideally required. But orders were simple: hold the enemy as long as possible, delay whatever counterattack the Axis planned, and buy time for reinforcements that might or might not arrive. The town itself was barely a town, more a scattering of buildings, a few oil facilities, some wells, and a narrow coastal road that cut through a landscape of low sabkha, salt marsh, and deep sand. Strategically, however, it was one of the few places where a defender could conceivably form a line. To the south stretched impassable desert, to the north the shimmering sea. Any attacker would be forced to come through a narrow corridor. For this reason, the British hoped that even their small force could hold back whatever was coming. At dawn on the morning of March 31st, the horizon was still, the only movements the spiraling dust devils dancing across the flats. Lieutenant Alan Cooper of the King's Royal Rifle Corps had been awake most of the night, though not by choice. He had taken his turn manning a Bren gun, checking ammunition, and listening to the faint drone of distant engines that might have been trucks or maybe just the desert playing tricks. He rubbed sand from his eyes and squinted eastward. A golden haze blurred the sky. Something about the air felt different. "See anything?" Sergeant Miller asked as he approached. "Nothing definite, but something's coming." "Something is always coming," Miller sighed. But he, too, felt the tension. A soldier knows, even without being told, when a quiet moment is about to end. By mid-morning, German armored cars appeared on the far edge of the salt flats, tiny dark specks that grew larger as they approached. They moved with caution at first, probing, feeling for weaknesses, just as predators test the air before striking. The British anti-tank crews adjusted their sights. The gunners steadied their hands. Cooper felt the dryness in his throat, the quickening beat of his heart. The first shots rang out as a pair of German armored cars advanced too far. A 2-pounder anti-tank gun spat flame, its shell punching through the thin plating and sending black smoke curling into the air. For a moment, the desert was silent again. Then Rommel answered. A line of German vehicles emerged from the haze: panzers, half-tracks, support trucks, the works. They came in disciplined formation, engines growling, dust trailing behind them like banners of war. This was no probing force. This was the hammer. British artillery opened up. The sabkha echoed with explosions. Sand and smoke mixed with the shimmering heat. The first German assault stalled as the defenders held their ground, firing methodically, their training overcoming their fear. But the Germans did not retreat. They regrouped, maneuvered, and began working their way around the flanks, testing the southern edge of the British line where the terrain grew softer and harder to defend. Captain Harrington, commander of one of the British companies, felt the pressure mounting. Radio messages crackled with reports of German tanks attempting to bypass the defensive line. "Hold the line at all costs," he ordered. "If they get around us, we're done." But holding the line was becoming increasingly difficult. The defenders had only a handful of tanks left, mostly worn-out cruisers and a few light MKV tanks. Against Rommel's panzers, they were outmatched in speed, armor, and firepower. Still, the British tank crews fought with determination. Sergeant Peter Hargreaves, commanding one of the remaining cruisers, fired continuously at approaching panzers. The recoil shook the entire vehicle. Sweat dripped from his face despite the dry air. "They're coming fast," his gunner shouted. "Then we shoot faster," Hargreaves replied. His tank knocked out one panzer, then another, but a third German shell found its mark. The cruiser burst into flames. Hargreaves and his crew scrambled out, coughing and stumbling, diving for cover as the tank exploded behind them. Hargreaves survived, but the tank he had cared for and trusted was gone in a plume of fire. Meanwhile, German infantry moved forward under the cover of armored cars and Panzer IIIs. They advanced with eerie calm, using smoke and suppressing fire with brutal efficiency. The British riflemen, dug in along shallow trenches, met them with furious resistance. Cooper fired until his barrel overheated. Miller tossed grenades at an enemy squad that had gotten too close. Each British position fought independently, often cut off from the others, each man knowing that withdrawal was inevitable but refusing to give ground too easily. The fighting grew more chaotic as noon passed. Vehicles bogged down in the soft sabka. Supply trucks burned. Communications broke. Sandstorms of dust, created not by wind but by the movement of men and machines, reduced visibility to almost nothing. Yet, amid this chaos, something remarkable happened. The British line did not break. It bent, curved, shifted, but held enough to slow Rommel's advance significantly. Rommel himself watched the battle from a forward armored car, noting the tenacity of the defenders. He had expected an easy breakthrough, a quick drive toward Benghazi and then Tobruk. Instead, he found himself locked in a struggle for a position he had assumed would fall within an hour. He admired the stubbornness of the troops before him, but admiration did not temper his resolve. By mid-afternoon, however, Rommel had identified the weak point, the southern flank. There, the rougher terrain prevented the British from repositioning or reinforcing quickly. German tanks pushed hard, exploiting every gap. Australian engineers who had been dispersed throughout the line tried desperately to mine the southern approach, but the enemy advanced too rapidly for their efforts to be effective. Harrington realized the danger immediately. He radioed his battalion, "Prepare to withdraw. Delay the enemy as much as possible, but do not let yourselves be encircled." The order came too late for some units. Several anti-tank positions were overrun before they could limber their guns. Others managed to pull back in good order, firing as they retreated. The withdrawal quickly became a race against encirclement. Trucks sped westward, soldiers clinging to the sides. Wounded men were lifted aboard without ceremony. Officers shouted directions lost in the roar of engines and shellfire. Cooper and Miller were among the last to leave their sector. They fired their Bren gun until the last magazine was empty. As German infantry closed in, they sprinted toward a waiting truck. Bullets zipped past them, hitting the sand with sharp cracks. Cooper threw himself onto the truck bed, Miller right behind him, just as it lurched forward. "Close one," Miller gasped. "Too close," Cooper replied. The sun was sinking when the final defenders pulled back from Mersa El Brega. They left behind burning vehicles, shattered equipment, and the bodies of comrades who had stood their ground long enough to alter the entire course of Rommel's advance. The Germans claimed the position, but their victory had come at a cost. They had expected a swift breakthrough. Instead, they had been delayed for hours, forced to expend fuel, ammunition, and resources they had assumed would remain untouched for the pursuit that lay ahead. As night fell, the desert grew quiet again, though pockets of fighting continued into the darkness. The British survivors regrouped farther west, shaken but alive. They didn't yet know how significant their stand had been. They didn't know that by slowing Rommel at Mersa El Brega, they had given precious time to the defenders of Tobruk to fortify their positions. They didn't know that the siege of Tobruk, a siege that would frustrate Axis plans for months, might never have been possible without their sacrifice. For the men who fought there, Mersa El Brega was not forgotten. It was etched into their memories with the sharp clarity that only terror and survival can create. They remembered the way the air shimmered around advancing armored columns, the thud of shells hitting sand, the metallic crack of rifles, the deafening roar of tank engines fighting for traction. They remembered the taste of dust, the smell of burning oil, the sweat that soaked through their uniforms though the wind felt cool at dusk. But history, with its tendency to focus on the battles that became legends, allowed Mersa El Brega to sink quietly into the background. The world remembered names like Tobruk, Gazala, and El Alamein. Those battles were larger, longer, covered by reporters and celebrated in propaganda reels. Mersa El Brega became a footnote, an early skirmish, a preliminary engagement, a tactical delay. Yet the truth remains. Without this forgotten battle, the North African campaign would have unfolded very differently. In later years, some veterans tried to tell the story. Hargreaves, whose tank had burned out beneath him, wrote in a memoir that the battle was a furnace of confusion, courage, and dust. Cooper described it as the day the desert woke up. Others simply kept their memories to themselves, carried silently through the decades until time faded them away. Military historians eventually revisited that part of the campaign. Some recognized that Mersa El Brega represented more than a minor engagement. It was the moment Rommel showed his methods, his boldness, his ability to strike quickly and decisively. But it was also the moment British and Commonwealth troops proved that they could adapt to this new threat, fight against the odds, and stand firm long enough to make a difference. The battle was not glorious in the conventional sense. It did not end in triumph. It did not inspire songs or parades. It was grim, tense, and desperate. But it mattered. Years after the war, Cooper returned to the region while working in Libya. The oil fields had expanded, and modern facilities stood where makeshift trenches had been. He drove along the coastal road until he reached the flat plain he remembered. A few rusted tank hulls still lay half buried in the sand, their shapes softened by years of wind and sun. He stood there a long time, listening to the wind, imagining the roar of engines and the shouts of men long gone. No plaques marked the battlefield. No monuments rose from the earth. Only the desert remained, indifferent and endless. But to those who knew what had happened there, that emptiness was a monument in itself, a reminder of a day when ordinary soldiers, outmatched and outnumbered, held the line as long as humanly possible. For them, Mersa El Brega would never be forgotten.